Welcome to the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation's Meet the Scientists monthly webinar series. I'm Dr. Jeff Borenstein, President and CEO of the Foundation, and your host and moderator for today's webinar. Today, Dr. James Leckman will present Primary Prevention in Child Psychiatry, the Transformative Power of Children and Families. The Brain and Behavior Research Foundation is committed to alleviating the suffering caused by mental illness by awarding grants that will lead to advances and breakthroughs in scientific research. The Foundation is the largest private funder of mental health research grants. Since 1987, the Foundation has awarded more than $346 million. 100% of all donor contributions for research are invested in grants to scientists who are working to find breakthroughs in disorders such as ADHD, anxiety, autism, bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, depression, OCD, PTSD, and schizophrenia. I'm delighted to introduce Dr. James Leckman. Dr. Leckman is the Neeson Harris Professor of Child Psychiatry, Psychology, and Pediatrics at Yale University School of Medicine. Dr. Leckman is the recipient of a 1993 Distinguished Investigator Grant, the 2007 Ruane Prize for Outstanding Achievement in Child and Adolescent Psychiatric Research, and is a member of our Scientific Council. Today's webinar will begin with Dr. Leckman's presentation. This will be followed by a question and answer period. To submit your questions, please use the Questions tab on the control panel of your screen. Feel free to submit your questions throughout the presentation. Following the presentation, I'll present your questions to Dr. Leckman and will address as many of them as possible in the time allotted. And now, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. James Leckman. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jeff. I hope everyone can hear me.
And yes, sounds good. Yes.
It's a real honor, I must say, to be invited to do this monthly webinar. And I am so grateful to the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation. I've been honored on many occasions, but I think that I am most grateful for the opportunities that it has provided to some of my younger colleagues to really get a start in this area of work that is so important for all of us. I guess the other thing I wanted to say, and I'll probably come back to this at the end, is with the passing of Connie Bieber, I guess it's really a painful time in many ways, and it's just remarkable what she and her husband Steve have done over the past 3 decades with regard to moving forward research in this important area. And I'm very, very grateful. During my presentation, and probably I have far too many slides and we'll have a chance to go through, I'll be telling you a few stories along the way. And with that, perhaps I'll just go ahead and get started. And here at Yale, we have an obligation to reveal whatever disclosures we might need to make before doing presentations. And I'm honored still to have a research grant from the National Institutes of Health. I'm probably best known for my work on Tourette syndrome and obsessive-compulsive disorder. But what I'll be talking about today is actually some work that, at some level, and I'll tell you that story before too long, of work that began years and years ago, back at least 20 years ago, when we were looking at cerebral spinal fluid levels of various metabolites of dopamine and the norepinephrine and the serotonin system. And somehow that led us, and I'll tell you the story in a few minutes, about the possible role that oxytocin, which is a neuropeptide, which at the time I didn't really know very much about, apart from the fact that it was released in a pulsatile way when mothers were giving birth, and it was crucially important during breastfeeding. But I'll come back to that story in a few minutes. The other thing I would just say in terms of the various awards and grants that we currently have is that we're currently working with disadvantaged populations around the world, and I'll be telling you the story about what we're currently up to in Beirut, Lebanon, as well as in Brazil, and trying to work with families to find a way to improve their parenting skills. And this is usually best done within groups of mothers or groups of fathers. And when they become more responsive to their very young children, it can make a real difference in terms of how the children respond to them, as well as what the long-term outcomes are for those children. But that's going to be part of the story along the way. So I'd like to offer just a couple of perspectives before we get underway, and what I'll be doing is presenting these perspectives and then going over a few key concepts before going through some of the specifics. But I'm convinced that we're all deeply interconnected, and although our society and the way that we're raised often emphasizes the me of the world, the reality is that nothing is ever accomplished by one person alone. We need to work together. And I guess what's amazing to me is that when you look at the neural circuitry of the brain, you also see that it's this interconnected matrix that we have, that one neuron doesn't accomplish anything by itself. It's only by the connections that it makes with other neurons, either near or far away in these various nodes, that make a difference in terms of our ability to think, act, and behave. And the same is true if you ask the sociologist about what's going on within our social networks. And that's a diagram that was prepared by actually one of my colleagues here at Yale, but basically reflects the social networks that exist within at least one of the neighborhoods of New Haven. And you can see some individuals are sort of at nodal points, while others are not. And perhaps the most fascinating part of the story for me is that in my work with the Fetzer Institute, which is based out in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and it's an interesting story, and if anybody wanted to ask me some questions about that, I'd be glad to answer them. But I was working with an advisory team that they had on the natural sciences, and one of the people that they invited to be part of the group was an astrophysicist who knew all about dark matter and dark energy in the cosmos. And I guess what I was particularly fascinated by is that when he actually was talking about this and showing us some slides, the simulation, not that any of the physicists really know what dark matter and dark energy really is, but when they do simulations of what it must involve, what they come up with is this networking that you can see here in this slide, that even at the level of the cosmos, we're all deeply interconnected. I guess the other reality is that whatever else is true, we're in a constantly changing world. Things never stay the same. And I think that interconnection and this ever-changing nature of our world are things that I just wanted to offer an initial perspective on. And it's one of my favorite quotes from Martin Luther King. And it basically echoes the same message. In a real sense, all life is interrelated. All persons are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. And this is the fundamental interrelated nature of reality. So what I'll be focusing on is how strong a case is for our field to invest more in primary prevention. As some of you may know, there has been a recent refocusing with regard to the RDAC process, which is basically looking at are there dimensions of observable behavior and neurobiological measures that we can look at that will help understand some of the mental disorders that we've been studying and that we've been working with the families for these many years. And so much of the research is also focused on specific disorders. And of course, in my case, it's obsessive-compulsive disorder and Tourette syndrome. More recently, I've been doing a fair amount of work with regard to attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. But I guess the question is, how strong a case can be made for our field to invest more in primary prevention? I was also so pleased to see that the very latest review issue of Neuropsychopharmacology actually was asking this question and looking at the impact of stress on brain pathology, treatment, and prevention. So I think that I'm not alone in this moment in time looking for ways in which we can perhaps do a better job of preventing and alleviating some of the suffering that's caused by mental illness in terms of simply reducing the likelihood that it's going to be occurring in the first place. So here are 6 concepts that I'd like to just sort of walk you through very briefly. And I'll tell you a little bit of each of them before I go through the actual slides that discuss them. The whole ecosystem, I guess this comes back to Urie Bronfenbrenner and sort of looking at what the environment is, both at the micro level, at the macro level, and how that impacts individuals. And I'm going to be focusing, of course, on the very earliest environments in which we can take a look at. And although I won't be talking about it a great deal, I guess I'm convinced that what happens in utero during the very earliest periods of embryonic development and fetal development, as well as in the first months and years of life, have a big impact on who we become and what we're capable of doing. Another really important concept, I'll show you a picture of John Bowlby and attachment, and emphasize all secure attachment, a responsive give and take between the very young child, and it can really make a difference. I guess it makes me think of some of the work that's ongoing down in Atlanta, Georgia, Ami Quinn and Larry Scahill and others, where they're actually looking at how the fetus is responding to hearing its own mother's voice versus another voice in utero, and sort of tracking that behavior. So I think it's not only how you interact after the child is born, it's also the presence of the other and the attachment figure actually during the course of very early development. A huge issue that I'll probably spend a fair amount of time on has to do with adverse childhood experiences. And in some ways, when I talk about prevention, I'm talking about violence prevention. Is there some way that we can actually make a difference in terms of reducing the amount of negative experiences, these adverse experiences, particularly exposure to violence in our young children? I'll talk about the work that's being done around the world with regard to programs that have been developed to help parents become more responsive. And there's also compelling data in my mind, and this is where the whole idea of the transformative power, that the way I was parented has an impact on how I parent as a new father. And it isn't, written in stone, but there's a way in which how you were parented influences how you parent your child. And if we can make a difference in that regard, if the parenting experience in the earlier generation was not as positive as it might have been, can we have a transformative power intergenerationally to influence how children are raised, not only in the coming generation, but in future generations as well? And I'll end with these discussions about concepts by talking about resilience. So this is just a model in terms of the ecosystems that I was talking about. And the minds and bodies of children are shaped by their day-to-day interactions with their parents, other relatives, peers, teachers, other members of the community. And it's interesting, one of the key elements here that I would just want to emphasize is that critical periods are important. And it was interesting, I was giving a talk down at UNICEF headquarters just a few weeks ago, and Anthony Lake had asked me to come in and talk about early brain development to the Friends of Children. And I think there must have been the primary country representatives from at least 30 or 40 different nations there. And one of the things that I emphasized was this notion of critical periods. And actually, there have been a number of Nobel Prizes that have been given for the work that's been done on critical periods and on attachment. I guess it makes me think of Konrad Lorenz and David Hubble, among others. But it's amazing when you begin to look at early brain development, the number of synapses that are formed per second are estimated somewhere around 700 to 1,000. And of course, that pace is never achieved again. And this is how those nerve cells are interconnected with one another. And so it really determines the circuitry. And as we move on to multimodal imaging and resting state conductivity and all the other things that are possible to do these days in terms of looking at brain activity, that reminds me, I've been busy. Jeff will be glad to know that I've finished the first 4 or 5 reviews for the Young Investigator Awards that will be announced later this year for the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation. But by the age of 3, a child's brain is twice as active as an adult brain. And the reality is that the early experiences that that child has determine the capacity of the brain in terms of its structure and function. So here's a very famous work in our area, the first of 3 volumes that John Bowlby. And it's interesting, one of the things that I've been so privileged to do, and I am a very fortunate person, is that I've been able to do sabbatical leaves actually in Cambridge. And actually, John Bowlby worked with Robert Hind, who's actually still at the Subdepartment of Animal Behavior at the University of Cambridge. And I've done 2 sabbaticals there, so it's been a lot of fun for me to be present in working with others that were very close to John Bowlby. And as I said before, if the caretakers are sensitive and responsive to the child's needs, they provide a secure base for that child to explore the world. And it has a big impact on the child's later emotional and cognitive development, as well as their investment in future interpersonal relationships. So to be a little probably too personal again, I believe that patterns of early caregiving matter. And it's interesting that when you look from an evolutionary perspective, the biobehavioral systems that are involved in parenting are actually fairly highly conserved. So I'd like to introduce you to my daughter, Emily, and I hope that she is listening or not, I'm not sure, but this is right after the birth of her first son. She now has 3 children, but that's Caleb. And it's wonderful to see what it's like in terms of the interaction and the sort of serve and response that you see from a very young infant and the caretakers. So I mentioned oxytocin before, and I guess this is time for one of those other stories that I need to tell you, is that when we were doing those studies with regard to various cerebral spinal fluid metabolites, and here I was working with Wayne Goodman, among others, we were focused on obsessive-compulsive disorder and Tourette syndrome. And we had gone through all of the usual suspects, looking at the biogenic amines involved in dopamine and norepinephrine and serotonin. And keeping the remaining specimens in the freezer, I thought it might be really important to see if there's anything else out there that would be reasonable to measure in the cerebral spinal fluid. So about that time, a paper came out of the group at NIMH. Marty Altimus at the time was there before she moved on eventually to Cornell. And she was working with another friend and colleague of mine, Dennis Murphy. And they reported that individuals with obsessive-compulsive disorder had high levels of a neuropeptide, oxytocin, called vasopressin. And I started doing a little bit of research about vasopressin at the time. This is way back in the early 90s. And realized before too long that outside of the hypothalamus, which is this key structure at the base of our brain, it's very involved in homeostasis and sleep-wake cycles and all sorts of other things, stress response, that it was highly gender dimorphic in the sense that there was much more of this arginine vasopressin in the brain of males than there were for females. And I came up with the idea that, oh, maybe if we looked at our data with regard to those individuals that had Tourette syndrome as well as Tourette's plus OCD, or the individuals with OCD, we would find those that had Tourette and OCD would be the ones with the very highest levels of arginine vasopressin, because it turns out that tic-related OCD and, of course, Tourette syndrome occur more commonly in boys, in males, than it does in girls. So, among other things, I decided that I just needed to learn more about vasopressin, and I went off to what's called a Gordon conference. This one was actually held up in Dartmouth University. And the guy who was running it, Bill North, was an expert on these neuropeptides. And at some point during the conference, I actually approached him and asked him, would it be possible for him to measure arginine vasopressin in the cerebral spinal fluid specimens that we had? And he said, sure. But if we do that, then I have to measure the sister neuropeptide as well. And that turned out to be oxytocin. So we sent him the blinded specimens. And about a month later, he calls me up on the phone, is so excited. And he said, who are these people? Who are these people? I've never seen levels like this before. And it turned out that some of the individuals that we had sent the data for, or the specimens for, had very high levels of oxytocin. And of course, at the time, the only thing I really knew about oxytocin was that it was involved in uterine contractions and in milk release. I didn't realize that males had as much of it as women. And it was the whole question about and it turned out that the group that had the highest levels of oxytocin weren't the individuals with Tourette syndrome. They were the ones that had OCD time around puberty. So then there was the question, oxytocin have to do with OCD. And this was the beginning of a line of work that has continued until I'll be talking about later, is really just another echoing of that. And basically, I still remember thinking about this and then remembering that when we were expecting our daughter, Emily, I was an intern out in San Francisco, and we lived on the third floor of this sort of hotel apartment complex. And I remembered that every time my wife coughed or had a fever during the pregnancy, I was so worried that something bad was going to happen. And then I remembered that my wife changed during the time that she was pregnant, and that she became, I guess you'd have to say, obsessive-compulsive. She even had me move the refrigerator from the kitchen out so that I could clean underneath it. Everything had to be perfect and just right. I had to repaint. And I found myself building this cradle, out of, wood specimens on the kitchen floor in this third floor walk-up. And then I started talking to my friends and presenting some of our data about the oxytocin and OCD. And one thing led to another, and one of my colleagues here at Yale, who's now the director of the Child Study Center, Linda Mays, suggested that we start studying parenthood. And initially, the question was, how obsessive-compulsive are new parents? And we recruited mothers and fathers in various ways just before the delivery and then following them for the weeks and months afterwards. I guess one of my colleagues who's now at Columbia, Nim Tottenham, was a research assistant at the time, and she was leading a group of Dancing Through Pregnancy, and it was wonderful because she was able to recruit a number of people for our study. But it turns out that if you actually go in and interview families in the home, that the level of preoccupation that you see in new parents is remarkable, and it reaches a bit of a peak right at the time of birth. How long can you go without thinking about your baby? It turns out that it's really just a matter of minutes or seconds for many. So anyway, coming back to this slide, you can see the 9 amino acids that make oxytocin, and I can tell you arginine is very similar. and it's actually adjacent in terms of its chromosomal location. I have a picture here of the receptor that is so important in terms of oxytocin having its effects in the brain and body, and this is a picture of Sue Carter, who is a wonderful colleague and was one of my major teachers with regard to oxytocin. And there was a special issue of Science, I guess in August of 2014 on parenting. Here's one of my colleagues, Maria, with her new daughter, Aftab. This is another picture showing some of the areas in which the oxytocin is released in various areas of the brain, and it's actually the one in green in the paraventricular nucleus and the inferior orbital nucleus are the ones where the oxytocin is released, but it goes all over the place in the brain and down through the spinal cord, and also is released through the anterior pituitary as well. But high levels of oxytocin are associated with responsive, affectionate caregiving. And interestingly, that's true for mothers. What's the correlation, and this is work of Ruth Feldman and Bar Ilan, she's found that actually with dads, higher levels of oxytocin are associated with what is called stimulatory play, throwing the baby up in the air and hopefully catching the baby. It's a fascinating story. Anyway, more securely attached individuals as adults show an increased reward response to being with their child and less of an aversive reaction to hearing their babies cry. Eventually, we moved on from doing these interview studies in the home to actually doing brain imaging studies. And I guess the big mistake that I made way back when was that I didn't think it would make any sense to try and measure oxytocin in the periphery given the fact that it was released in this pulsatile way. But that turns out not to be the case, and here again I'm referring to some of the work I've done, and who's taken the lead with this is Ruth Feldman, who had been a postdoc with us many years ago. And I should mention James Swain, who's currently at the University of Michigan, but we've also been looking not only at the mother's brain and how that changes, but also the father's brain and how that changes. And again, coming back to a point I made early on, parenting begets parenting. How we were raised as children has an impact on how we raise our own children. So this is just the cover of that Science issue from August of 2014. We could go through this in more detail. And a reason why I say that it has a transformative intergenerational potential has to do with epigenetics. And I could give another talk for some time about, for years, we thought when we actually sequenced the genome, we would find that we actually had different coding regions in our genome. And it's only been in the last 3 or 4 years with the ENCODE data that we realized that the coding regions of our genes are virtually identical to what you'd find in a primate or a rodent. And what's different about the human species is the non-coding regions, the regions. And these are the regions that can be impacted through epigenetic mechanisms in terms of altering how the genes are transcribed. And it literally provides a legacy that transcends the genes. I guess the other thing that's fascinating about this whole story, and I'll come back to it as well, is that all of this has an impact with regard to the interconnectedness within the brain, but also with regard to our physical health. So I'll spend a fair amount of time, and I do want to leave a few minutes for questions, but let me go through this issue about the adverse childhood experiences. So we mentioned this before. Here's a list of some of the dreadful things that happen to children. And what's interesting about it is that it has an impact. And if you look at the number of the ACEs that a person has experienced in childhood and adolescence, it actually is predictive of what you see in terms of an increased risk for depression in adulthood. If you have 5 or more of these events, you're 5 times as likely as somebody who never had one of these events to have a diagnosed depression. And as I mentioned before, it has an impact with regard to physical health as well, and we could talk about telomeres and all sorts of other things. But here you see this gradual increase once you have 7 or 8 of these adverse experiences in terms of the risk for heart disease. So I'm going to be becoming a little more serious in terms of what the realities are. But sadly, the exposure to violence affects 2 out of every 3 of our children. out of the 76 million children currently residing in the United States, 46 million can expect to have their lives touched by violence, crime, abuse, psychological trauma each year. And this is from a report that was prepared by the Attorney General's National Task Force on Children Exposed to Violence. And of course, across the globe, this has the potential to derail a child's security, health, and happiness, ability to learn and grow. And this was at the conference I went to over in The Hague last year about this time, Growing Up in Conflict, the Impact of Children's Mental Health and Psychosocial Well-Being. And it's really just amazing and so disturbing. This is just an image from the situation that's currently unfolding in Syria. And sadly, exposure at an early age can be extremely detrimental to a child's development and can be causally related to a broad range of negative outcomes, including behavioral and emotional problems. And here, I want to say a word about the fact that violence can become self-perpetuating, and this comes back to this notion of parenting begets parenting, and this whole idea of vicious versus virtuous cycles. And it turns out that when you have responsive and you make an investment in them, it actually has an impact with regard a child is exposed to. So it has a potential effect in terms of promoting the safety and well-being of the children as well as the nature of the relationship. And what's interesting about the reality is that if you've been abused or neglected as a child, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to go on to become a perpetrator of violence, although you're at much higher risk to do that. You're probably at an even higher risk of being re-victimized as well. And if we can make a change somewhere along the way, early on, in terms of how the next generation is raised, maybe we can reverse that vicious cycle into a more virtuous cycle. And there is increasing amounts of data that are showing that responsive parents, number of adverse child experiences that a child encounters, and it can have a positive impact on brain structure and function, and even how our DNA is read and transcribed. And that's the material epigenetic issues that actually alter which parts of which gene during brain development and during other periods of time. The last concept that I wanted to briefly mention is resilience. And although early childhood adversity and poor parenting can set the stage for this vicious cycle and potentially lead to the intergenerational transmission of poor parenting, it is really important to emphasize that in many cases, children who experience adversity as a child, including physical abuse, will not adopt the same behavior with their child. And these are some of the folks that I've been working with. This is the Bernard Van Leer Early Childhood Matters report looking at responsive parenting, a strategy to prevent violence. Here's a WHO report that came out in 2013, Preventing Violence, Evaluating Outcomes of Parenting Programs. So it turns out that there are a large number of parenting programs that have been developed across the globe, ranging from home visitation programs starting during the pregnancy to working with groups of parents of preschool children. Only a few have been rigorously assessed, and most of these have been here in the US and in other high-income countries. And what's interesting, as you sort of go down this path, and it's sort of been there for me, and I've seen it firsthand, what's crucial is multi-sectorial partnerships. Families, providers, government agencies, other non-governmental organizations. And those partnerships are the things that are really key to developing sustainable programs of proven value. So one of my friends is David Oles, out in Colorado now, although he initially started this work at Cornell years and years ago. And that's the Nurse Family Partnership. Minding the Baby program is one that's been developed here at Yale. I don't have a slide for it, but the MOMS project that Megan Smith is involved in is another great example of prenatal to the first years of life and the impact that it can have. And then some of the preschool programs include the Perry High Scope, the ABC project, the Chicago Longitudinal Study. And we've had this fairly close relationship, interestingly, with a Turkish foundation, the Mother Child Education Foundation, and I'll tell you some more about that. And then another wonderful program is something called Supporting Fathers' Involvement. That's basically a co-parenting program where you bring the dads in as well as having the mothers there. And I'll say a word or two about the importance of fathers in a minute or two. So the Nurse-Family Partnership, and here's a picture of David, is a focus on pregnant first-time mothers with low family income, often unmarried teens. And what's amazing about what David has done is that he's been able to follow, after a random clinical trial, he's been able to follow their behavioral and health outcomes over more than 30 years. And interestingly, the last kind of time that he actually worked with the families in Elmira, New York, they were actually collected buccal swabs and were able to actually measure and collect some DNA that they then looked at with regard to the epigenetic signatures. And that's a paper that's currently in review right now that I'm honored to be a co-author of. But basically, this starts during the pregnancy. I don't need to go through all the details, but there was basically a nurse that would come into the home, at least on a monthly basis, through the first 2 years of life, as well as during the pregnancy. And here are some of the consistent results that you can see. Reduction in child injuries, fewer subsequent pregnancies, greater intervals between births, an increase in the father's involvement, increases in employment, reductions in welfare, and the need for things like food stamps, improvement in school readiness. And what's interesting is that the intervention had its biggest impact on the mothers who were at the highest risk. This is just a word about the Minding the Baby program. I'd be glad to answer some questions about that, but it's been Lois Sadler here in the School of Nursing, as well as her appointment here at the Child Study Center, as well as Arietta Slade, Nancy Close, and Linda, among others. So here's a picture of Kyle Pruitt, another one of my colleagues here at Yale, bless his heart, who's actually the man who really helped, along with his wife, Marcia Klein Pruitt, to actually develop this Supporting Fathers' Involvement. And some of the things that they have realized in following the outcomes of the families that they've been working with is that there is a protective and positive effect of father involvement on the children's social, educational, behavioral, and psychological outcomes across the lifespan. And they have done fairly lengthy follow-ups to this. Better psychological health, less externalizing and internalizing behavior problems, less substance use, less criminality and delinquency, less of an economic disadvantage, a greater capacity for empathy, better peer relationships, self-esteem, and life satisfaction. If we can manage to do that, we will definitely alleviate some of the suffering caused by mental disorders. So this is really another turning point in terms of my work. I was on my way to Israel, and I was asked by one of my friends, Yanki Yazgan, who's trained with us for 5 years here at Yale, but now has become one of the most outstanding child psychiatrists in Turkey, to stop by on my way to Israel and have a conversation with the board of the Mother Child Education Foundation. And what they wanted to talk about was why it was that when they brought together groups of fathers to enhance the early child development and to be more responsive to their children, that these fathers, even though they came from 4 districts of Istanbul and regions of Turkey that were fairly difficult, that they actually became friends despite the fact that they came from different religious and ethnic backgrounds. Now, what the situation in Turkey is today is, of course, another issue altogether, although it's interesting that this foundation, at least until recently, has been able to actually implement their program at scale in Turkey, although I think that's increasingly becoming problematic. But they wanted to know what's going on in the brain that these fathers became friends, even though they came from cultural backgrounds. So ACHEV is the acronym for the Mother Child Education Foundation, and basically they're looking to promote human development to its maximum potential through investing in young children and families. And the Lebanon, actually, in Palestinian refugee camps, that I'll mention. There are actually groups of mothers that come together for 25 sessions, and they talk about not only positive child-rearing methods and how to communicate with your child, they also do home visits, and also just the realities of the social, emotional, and physical developmental processes in children, the importance of spending quality time and playing with the child. Unfortunately, in some of those traditional societies, there's actually not much of an interaction with the young children until the child's able to talk. And that's a real shame, because the interactions really early in development and even during fetal life are probably crucially important in really trying to develop secure attachments, and responsive parenting can really make a difference in that regard. Also include, who are you? Speaking to the mother, what do you want to achieve in your life? How can we try and make slide of the group that we've been working with, the Arab Resource Collective, on Isa, who's a pediatrician in Beirut. So there have been some longitudinal studies that have been done in the programs over the past 22 years, in the Turkish program. And I guess the question is, if we can enhance early child development, is that a potential pathway to violence reduction in the home and the community, and is it also a pathway to prevent psychopathology and build a more peaceful world? I won't go through this in a great deal of detail because we're running a little short on time, but here's a fellow by the name of James Heckman, and he is actually a Nobel laureate in economics, and he's at the University of Chicago. And it turns out that these prospective longitudinal studies that have been done and where people have been followed up for decades, it's very clear that they have economic benefits as well as social and emotional benefits for the children. So this is just looking at one of the findings. This is from Ypsilanti, Michigan, this very high-scope preschool study, when these individuals that went through the program were 40 years of age. Look at the difference with regard to IQ. Oops. 67% versus 28% who were not in the program, and graduated from high school. Was an important one in terms of the reduction in times arrested ×5 by the age of 40. The ones who did not receive the program, 55% of them did versus 36% who did participate in the program. And when you translate that into cost benefit, there's a huge benefit, at least $12 per dollar spent in terms of actually this particular, and basically Heckman has shown this with regard to other longitudinal studies as well. And interestingly, Heckman has also participated, as you can see, in this more recent Science article looking at early childhood investments, how they substantially boost adult health, that is to say physical health as well as one's mental health. And this is what he calls the Heckman Equation, and if you type that into Google, you'll find all sorts of things. But basically, the programs that target at the earliest years are the ones that have the biggest economic return. Would you rather invest today in building more prisons, or would you rather invest today in building a programs that can actually have a sustainable benefit for the economy? Of course, there are many challenges with regard to these programs. There are so many. Which one to choose for a given setting? Is there an established curriculum? What's the evidence that it works? Has it been piloted and adapted for the community? Can it be implemented with fidelity? Does it take advantage of group process? So this is something to emphasize. I've been so impressed with what Kyle has been doing, as well as the group that have been involved with the early childhood education program. By bringing together groups of mothers, they become friends and they become resources even after the program is finished. One of the realities currently is that we're in the midst of this randomized trial. We're finishing it up. But what's interesting is that some of the mothers that have been randomized to the intervention don't want to stop. They want to have the centers continue to hold the meetings. And it's an interesting issue. I guess it comes back to one of the ethical dilemmas that I found myself in a few years ago when we were actually implementing these programs, was that, well, if it's a random assignment and the mothers have expressed an interest in having the program, is it really fair and ethical not to offer them the program once they have gone through sort of the treatment as usual phase of not receiving the intervention because they would have been randomized to the no intervention group. And so in the end, we actually made a decision that if the mothers wanted to have the program implemented, we would do that in a period of time in the months following the completion of the randomized portion of the trial. And I can come back to that if people have an interest. So this is some of our international work, although I'm convinced that we need to do more work here in the United States as well. I'm going to tell you a few things about the Early Childhood Peace Consortium, the Ernst Strugman Forum, next steps in Brazil and Lebanon, and if there's time, we're also doing some work in Israel and Palestine that I'll bring you up to date on as well. So the Early Childhood Peace Consortium is something that sort of grew out of our work with the Fetzer Institute. UNICEF has been a key player. This is a picture of Tia Brito and Rima Sala. They're really the leaders. Rima had been with UNICEF for decades. She's currently on our faculty. Tia is currently a senior advisor, but originally had been on the faculty here at Yale, although she trained at Columbia in early child development. The first planning meeting was done at this meeting in Assisi, Italy, that was sponsored by the Fetzer Institute. This is a fellow who had been the president of the General Assembly back, I think, in 2011, Nasser al-Nasser from Qatar. But a wonderful opportunity to meet with colleagues, and that's where we really framed this whole Peace Consortium idea. And then another wonderful person who is probably much better known than most of the rest of us is Javier Hermes. He's the fellow who actually runs that chain of clothing and sort of other high-scale products that some of you may be familiar with called Hermes. And he actually sponsored a meeting of the planning for this Peace Consortium in his home in Marrakesh, Morocco, back in 2013. The launch took place in September, and this is a number of the Yale folks. Actually, I guess I see a number of individuals in addition to the folks at Yale. These are individuals actually from the Turkish Foundation. Here is a colleague that has been involved in terms of the epigenetic story that Michael Meany, that is basically up at McGill University and also spending time in Singapore, that I don't really have time to talk about that whole epigenetic story as well, although it's a key part of my own journey. So in the Early Childhood Peace Consortium was really designed to, and we brought together over 140 partners from multiple sectors to create a legacy of sustained peace, drawing on the transformative power of early child development. The last meeting of the entire group was back in June of last year in Istanbul, Turkey. And this is the focus again was how to create a legacy of sustained peace, drawing on the transformative power of early child development, as I mentioned. And it's moving forward. The last meeting of the steering committee was in Amman, Jordan last month, and I'm hoping that it will actually lead to some of the goals that we're hoping to achieve. Let me very briefly talk about the Ernst Strugman Forum. This was another thing that came out of our work together with colleagues from various disciplines. And basically, what we wanted to do was to bring experts together from a variety of backgrounds, basic sciences, including folks like Sue Carter that you can see there, early child development, cross-cultural psychology, interfaith dialogue, and peace building from over 50 countries, and to ask these questions about what do we know, and what more can we learn, and what's the best way to move about doing that. And this was published a year or so ago by the MIT Press, and Pathways to Peace, the Transformative Power of Children and Families. It's something that I often will give to people that come and talk with me about some of these issues. And basically, there was no PowerPoint presentation like the one I'm giving you at this meeting. It took a whole week of time. But there were background papers, including some by Robert Hine that I mentioned earlier, as well as others. And each of the four groups only met once or twice a day. And if you had the opportunity, you could go to one of the other groups, even though you were not a member of it, to be part of their discussion as well. So there was a lot of dialogue. And what we had the opportunity to do then was to have a rapporteur sort of summarize what the discussion was within each of the groups, as well as providing an overview as well. I've been doing a fair amount of work in Brazil, and thank you, Euripides, Miguel, and others, but this intersectorial partnership, and this is also work we've been doing with the Global Health Leadership Institute here at Yale, brings together experts, and we were focused on early child development, and I guess the title of this one was Integrating Interventions for Early Child Development in Brazil, and we met in the summer of 2014, and again in 2015, we've had interns going down, and our friend Cesar Rosario, who's now at the Federal University of Brazil, is actually beginning to implement a program. But most importantly, or maybe not, but one of the very important elements is we had actually the First Lady of Sao Paulo, Ana Stella Haddad, who's been leading the effort in something called Sao Paulo Carinosa, which is again focused on disadvantaged communities in Sao Paulo and how can they actually help support those families in focusing on their the early childhood. And of course, I'm not sure which is crazier, Turkey or Brazil, but my goodness, what a chaotic situation they're currently in politically at the moment there. So we're implementing a version of Minding the Baby. There's also a version of this ACHA program. And I was just in Nairobi, Kenya, where the Gates Foundation and Grand Challenges Canada had a meeting of the various individuals that had been funded in their All Children Thriving initiative, and one of the groups was the group from Brazil. This is the project in Lebanon. There's not really enough time to go through it. It'll be interesting to see what the results are of our randomized trial. The picture of Dr. Ghassan Issa, and if there was more time, and these are some of my wonderful colleagues, including Angie Quartuga, and others, and Kaveh Gashnud. Kaveh's been over to Lebanon who knows how many times. But we're looking at all of these outcomes, looking at how well the children are doing, as well as what the impact is with regard to mothers and families as well. If there was time, I'd show you a bit of this video from Dr. Ghassan Issa. The last thing I'll just very briefly mention, and I'd like to leave at least 5 minutes for questions, is some work, and this is, I can thank Dr. Donald Cohen, who had been the director here at the Child Study Center for years, as well as Ernesto Caffo, who's the fellow who's in charge of Foundation Child and Telefono Azzurro in Italy, that we've been basically bringing together mental health professionals from both Israel and Palestine to do joint projects together that will lead to some degree of enhancing the well-being of children and families affected by the conflict, and hopefully having an impact for future generations. And of course, the situation there is also problematic. The realities are as well. So this was a meeting that we had in Florence, and the officials as well as individuals from both communities. And the most recent meeting was actually in Tel Aviv in June of 2015 that was again sponsored by the Italian government. This is a wonderful program for children, Hands in Hand Schools, Center for Jewish Arab Education in Israel. And this is actually my last slide, so I've run through them fairly quickly, but I think there's time for at least 5 minutes of questions. We need to take action to make our world a better for our children and for future generations. And I believe that some of the next include a commitment to refine, adapt, and implement in a sustainable fashion some of these parent-child programs that have shown to have proven value across the globe, and including here in the United States. So Jeff, I think with that, I'm going to say thank you very much. And again, thank you to NARSAD and the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation. And let me know if there are some questions that I could possibly answer in the next 5 minutes or so.
Yes. Well, I'm going to say to you, Jim, thank you very much for the work that you've done and for this excellent presentation. And to me, one of the take-home messages is that this is an example of how basic science can then be translated into clinical science and methods of prevention that can have a tremendous impact. So thank you. And one of the areas of questions are, can you share with our audience, many of whom are parents, some of whom are grandparents, what are some of the key take into their home?
Yeah, I think it's an important question, and thank you for asking it, Jeff. And I think one of the challenges is how can we begin as early as possible? And what's so fascinating is that if a parent is preoccupied with, stress and the rest of it, and that's so true, can they be as responsive to their child as perhaps the optimal? When the child invites, and I have some wonderful videos that it would be great to show, but basically it's this call and response, this serve and return, where when the child interacts with you, you respond, and then the child responds back, and it's that kind of thing in early childhood that matters the most. Of course, as we think about older children, we need to be thoughtful about how to promote resilience, and again, it comes back to the environment. How can we help this child find a way to connect and interconnect with others in this way rather than becoming a member of some gang or some other dreadful opportunities that sometimes are opportunities that one can find in poorer districts of our communities. But the reality is that so many of our children are being exposed in a way that is really just terrifying to me. And if there's some way that we can actually work together to be more responsive to those children, the better it will be. But it's prevention early on rather than preventing. On the other hand, finding people who really care and who are willing to make a connection with you in terms of the treatment setting, that's crucially important. Again, in this interconnected world, how can we, and it's a huge challenge in terms of the medical community. We have, electronic medical records and all the other stuff that is present throughout our country now, and the costs are sometimes very high. But how can we help families find the support and care that they need? And of course, advocacy organizations can also be an important ingredient in terms of interconnecting families that are struggling with regard to their children's mental and physical well-being to come together and have an opportunity to speak with one another about what their realities are. So I don't think there's an easy answer, and the sad reality is that adverse life experiences in childhood are more common than we would like them to be, and if there's anything that we can do to reduce that, the better it will be. And we need to find a way to involve dads a lot more than they are. Sometimes if the dad's missing, it can be really a challenge for that child, particularly some of the boys, to find a way of making connections in a positive way within the community.
Well, I think that those are all important points, and I think you, during the presentation, made the point of how one of the benefits of the groups is the interaction among the members of the group and the support that they give to each other in helping them with these issues. And I think that's an important take-home message for people who are listening, that making the use of a number of support systems, and it goes back to that picture of the interconnectedness, is a way to help people in difficult situations.
Yeah, no, I'm totally convinced that that's the case. And I guess before we end, I just wanted to thank again the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation and all of the support that we have received here at Yale. And I'm convinced that it's really made a difference in terms of having young investigators enter our field and have successful careers that have a real impact on the families and children that we serve.
Well,
so thank you.
Thank you, and I want to thank you for the work that you do, for being a member of our scientific council. It really is our scientific council that's the backbone of the foundation, that makes a selection of all of the researchers and the young investigators that are so crucial to our field moving forward. So thank you for everything that you have done and continue to do for the field.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thanks. I also want to thank everybody who joined us today. All of the research that we fund is made possible through private donations. And if you'd like to make a gift, please visit bbrfoundation.org or call 1-800-829-8289. I hope that you'll join us next month when Dr. Sarah Feinberg, a recipient of a Brain and Behavior Research Foundation Young Investigator Grant at Yale, when Dr. Feinberg will present a webinar entitled Social Learning in Borderline Personality Disorder. This will take place on Tuesday, June 14th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Once again, thank you all for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day. Take care, everybody.